Hi, you're listening to Irish Stew, the podcast for the global Irish nation. I'm Martin Nutty, and together with my co-host John Lee, we're working to bring all the Irish together, whether you're hyphenated or not. We'll be talking to Irish people of excellence about their lives, what they do, their successes and failures, and how they relate to that small green rock off the coast of Europe. If you like what we're doing in this space, please remember to subscribe to Irish Stew, and even better, leave a rating and review on your favourite podcast platform. John, say hello.
Hey, Martin. Good to be back with you here on The Stew. Looking forward to a great conversation today. I think our guest is going to be covering some territory that we're going to be looking at from different angles on future episodes of The Stew. So good to get going. Let's light this candle.
So I probably know Damian a little bit better. We've actually corresponded quite a bit through social media on and off. I came across his work specifically on the Irish in the American Civil War, which is his primary area of research right now. But there's more to Damian than that, and I'm looking forward to kind of hearing more about that in this course of this discussion, because Damian is actually both an archaeologist and a historian, but he's not just an ordinary old archaeologist. He's actually a battlefield archaeologist, and I'm sure he'll explain to us exactly what that means. But as I alluded, Damian's probably better known for his work in the American Civil War, specifically Irish participation in that. And he's actually published 2 books on the subject, and also maintains a website called IrishAmericanCivilWar.com. And he posts frequently there, not just blog posts, but also he does podcasts and also YouTube videos, and it's an incredibly rich resource. Now, the way I see Damian is he has his foot in 3 different countries, which is kind of anatomically difficult. He's currently pursuing a PhD in the Northumbria University, but he's in Ireland right now. But he spends a lot of time going back and forth between Ireland and America because of his research on the American Civil War.
Well, Martin, that makes him perfect for what we're trying to do here, the global Irish nation conversation. So that's a great element.
Yeah, he's kind of really a global Irishman. So without further ado, I'd like to bring Damian into the conversation. Damian, welcome to the podcast.
Cheers, Martin. Cheers, John. Thanks for having me on. Looking forward to the chat.
Martin, if I could jump in, I don't think we mentioned his last name so far. So he's not like Cher or Madonna. He doesn't just go by Damian, right?
Well, in the whole Irish history, American Civil War, he's just Damian.
Damian Shiels.
So let me kick this off, Damian. Let's just ask the very basic and obvious question, and we kind of like to talk about people's career arc. So, where did this fascination for things past come from?
Oh, that's a good question. I would always trace it back to Donegal, actually, which is a county that's very close to my heart. I suppose there's a good circular thing that I've only really come to appreciate in the last couple of years about be working on diaspora stuff is because I actually was born in England, not in Ireland. My parents were immigrants to London in the 60s and 70s. So I was born in London, but came back to Ireland when I was just under a year old, and grew up in West Limerick, actually in the same townland where the famous Ardagh Chalice was found. That used to be our claim to fame. Our house was the only house in the same townland where that chalice was found, which is one of the great pieces of early medieval Irish metalwork. So, I grew up kind of surrounded by that type of archaeological story. And then my mother is a native of North Donegal, and we used to go up there on holidays quite a lot, and I have always been very close to Donegal as a result. And particularly became fascinated by kind of, my first love, if you like, was Elizabethan history and late 16th century history, and read Hugh O'Donnell, and my favourite site in Ireland would be Doe Castle in Creasla, which is a phenomenal castle that would have been associated with some of the events of his life. And so that whole kind of Elizabethan period, I suppose, was one of the things that started to draw me in towards the conflict history and the story of military history and things like that. And from early on then in my archaeological career, I started to be focused on this sort of military and archaeological element of things. And that's kind of where things started to evolve from.
It's interesting you're up in Donegal, of course. That's the site of the infamous Flight of the Earls.
That's right, yeah.
You know, and I often viewed that particular event as essentially the death of Celtic Ireland or Gaelic Ireland, and then the beginning, obviously, of, you know, what is now considered to be modern Ireland. It's an incredibly important pivot point, and I don't think it's talked about often enough. But I just want to kind of talk a little bit about your archaeological career, because I think of it as that becoming first, you know, and how I understand your career, but maybe you can correct me on that and fill in some of the gaps. Why battlefield archaeology as opposed to garden variety archaeology?
Well, yeah, and I mean, it did come first, archaeology. I didn't do history, for example, when I first went to university. I did just archaeology. But I've always been more interested, I suppose, in historic archaeology than prehistoric archaeology. So tying archaeology and historical sources together to see what you come up with has always been a passion of mine. And it did come out of, I suppose, that kind of draw for this Elizabethan period. And so when I was quite early in my, you know, full-time professional career in archaeology, I was looking around at how I could use archaeology to explore that area and to explore these sites, these type of battlefield sites and things like that. And it hadn't been done very much, not really at all in the Republic of Ireland up to to that point, which is about 20 years ago now. And so very early on, I set up a project in late 2001 called the Kinsale Battlefield Project, which was designed to look at the events of the siege and battle at Kinsale. And you were mentioning, Martin, the Flight of the Earls in 1607 has been this watershed moment. And of course, the kind of battle that seemed to have led to that is this defeat of the Gaelic, Irish and Spanish forces by the forces of Elizabeth I at Kinsale in 1601. And at the time, there'd been a big, and again, it gives you this kind of sense of this cross-national thing. Battlefield archaeology had kind of grown up in the United States. Doug Scott, an archaeologist over there, had done work at the Little Bighorn, Custer's Last Stand, which had kind of shown the huge potential archaeology had to add to our knowledge of these events. And it had taken hold around then in Britain, particularly at that time, but not so much in Ireland. There had been small bits and pieces of work, but not so much here. And so that really seemed to me to be something that would just tie the passion I had for that period of the 16th century together with something new that needed to be done in archaeology. And it was driven a lot as well by the fact that none of these sites, and a lot of them still aren't, had any level of protection in Ireland. So we protected, a lot of prehistoric sites. We protect ring force that you see everywhere, all of this visible stuff, but because it's not so visible, we didn't protect it. And there were a couple of things that came in my career early on then that kind of added to that. So back in the early 2000s, it'd be one of the most controversial archaeological sites that was ever excavated in Ireland. But I spent 2 years as a supervisor working on Carrickmines Castle in South County Dublin. And there was a lot of controversy there over development of a road and things like this. It went to the Supreme Court and so on. But during those works, we actually uncovered a mass grave from people who died there during a 17th century engagement, a 1642 siege, which remains the only, the most significant mass grave associated with a military engagement that's been found in Ireland. And so I was very fortunate to be working on that as well. And I suppose all of that kind of came together to lead me to kind of push forward with that battlefield archaeology side of things.
In your research on the battlefield archaeology, and you talked about how it, it illustrates things that hadn't been seen before. Have you has battlefield archaeology upended understanding of a battle? Kind of changed the perception from what you've discovered?
It can do that. Often it complements. So in an Irish context, what it's really good at is we don't have a lot of brilliant sources for a lot of our sites, so it can be difficult to really gain a handle on what occurred there and how truthful certain historical accounts may be where they do exist. So we found stuff at Kinsale that relate to the size of the English siege works there, for example, that hadn't been recognized beforehand, even though the English had drawn these incredible maps that showed the size of their siege works and everything. But my colleague, Paul O'Keefe, who works on that project with me and directs it with me, was ultimately able to identify that the main English siege camp was bigger than the walled city of Derry was at the same time. So, it's immediately given us a sense of the scale of what was going on at that event that maybe we weren't getting just purely from looking at the primary historical sources all the time. So this type of thing is consistently adding little bits of nuance and things. And I think one of the big things that battlefield archaeology can do is it really drills down to an individual level. So as an example of that, some material I worked on that had been retrieved from the Aughrim battlefield, which is a 1691 battlefield, the bloodiest battle in Irish history between the Williamites and the Jacobites. A very small amount of material, but what it revealed was the kind of terror of the retreat. All the objects were relating to Jacobites fleeing this battlefield when they were being ridden down by Williamites. And it's desperately, this is the interpretation of the material, but a fairly solid interpretation, I think. Desperate efforts to kind of stave off these attacks, and then kind of evidence for almost certainly things like looting of bodies and uniforms and things like that after the battle is over. So it's really drilling down into the personal and individual that often, particularly with those earlier battles, you're not getting it, So when you kind of go forward to things like the Civil War, we have accounts of individual ordinary guys telling us what it was like or how they felt. We don't have that for a lot of 16th, 17th, even 18th century conflicts to the same degree, particularly in Ireland. And so that was one of the really good areas that it can give you an awful lot of information about.
So just picking up on that thread, Damian, I listened to a podcast that you did with Finn Dwyer recently on, of all things, a graveyard in County Wicklow called Prebin, and I strongly recommend that to any of our listeners. And you spoke specifically to the 1798 revolt and the battle on Vinegar Hill in very kind of poignant terms. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And Vinegar Hill is a very interesting one to be discussing on a podcast that's based out of America as well, because some of your listeners may or may not be aware, but there are a number of places in the United States that are called Vinegar Hill. Particularly now that are historically African-American neighborhoods and important African-American neighborhoods, but they originally got their names because of this battle. There's places in Australia named after it as well. And again, it's seen a bit like Kinsale in 1601. It's the decisive battle of the 1798 rebellion, which was a rebellion that was partially inspired by events in the United States and the Revolutionary War there, and events in France. But it was a particularly iconic battlefield because it had so many. There were thousands and thousands of these United Irish rebels down in the southeast of the country, but they were there with women and children, a huge camp, and Crown forces were moving in this pincer movement all around onto their camp, which is a very, very distinctive looking hill outside the town of Enniscorthy. And it is really, particularly in light of its use and the use of the 1798 rebellion in subsequent nationalism all the way through to 1916 and the Irish War of Independence, has become really iconic. And we went in there as part of a project that Wexford County Council were doing called the Longest Day Project. And it was great. We got a big multinational team of archaeologists in to conduct survey work. So it was the biggest survey that was ever undertaken on a battlefield in Ireland. And archaeology being what it is, we went down there we had a 4-week block of work, and we went down there for the first 2 weeks of work, and we said, okay, these are the areas we think are the most likely that we're going to get good results. And we went through them all, and we came out with one musket ball at the end of the first 2 weeks. And I was heading up the project, and I was going, oh, God, I better deliver something in this. This isn't looking too hot now. We'll have to find something. And we went back. We had to wait for some crops to be removed off fields. We went back for our second program of field work. We got into a couple of fields then that we had really wanted to get into actually in the first session, and we hadn't. And immediately we started finding material everywhere. and it was quite incredible what we were getting there. There was clear evidence for the actual assault lines of the government troops as they move up this hill towards the summit, towards these thousands of guys who were civilians trying to defend themselves, trying to launch attacks against these line of redcoats. Lines of bullets were being dropped when guys in the midst of combat were nervous, they're twitchy, they're trying to drop their bullets into their barrels and they're missing them. So a lot of the government troops were not terribly experienced troops either. So you get this sense, of just panic, of heightened emotions is almost revealed through this material, like what people are dropping. We got evidence of artillery being wheeled in to be fired at point blank range into the faces of people. It was the only reason it was there, this sort of grape shot that disintegrates people when it's being fired at them, carried in by by horses, light artillery. So just this real visceral landscape that emerges through the objects, elements of broken equipment, stuff that's giving you an idea that there's hand-to-hand combat there, which is almost certainly a rearguard action that the United Irish launched in order to allow the people escape off the top of the hill. So it's the type of emotive stuff that material gives you, again, to kind of go back to what we were chatting about earlier. It just gives you this really visceral connection to what was going on in those fields. And these fields just look like normal fields today, similar to a lot of the Civil War battlefields. I think for any of your listeners who haven't maybe encountered Irish battlefields, it's not like what you get with the National Park Service when you go to Gettysburg or Antietam or anything like this. We don't really look after our battlefields in the same way, although in Escorty and a decent section of it does have some level of protection, but they're just standard farmers' fields where people walk their dogs and stuff. Yet underneath the surface, it's almost like just waiting for it to be peeled back to reveal this kind of 3D landscape of what was occurring there in 1798. So quite remarkable. And all for we didn't do a colossal amount of work there. We were only there in total for 4 weeks of work. So, it just shows you the potential that those sites have to really connect us with those events.
I love that idea, the visceral, impact of because archaeology, it's either, Indiana Jones romanticized, or it has a kind of, dry and dusty feel to it in a way. But to hear that kind of emotional impact by things you're finding under the ground is really fascinating.
Yeah. And it relates over. Literally only because I was rereading about it again yesterday. It's you get that sort of thing off of a lot of the battlefields of the Civil War. I was just rereading the report, the Potter and Owsley's report on the remains that were found at Antietam of the Irish Brigade soldiers. And the guy in his mid-40s he had rosary beads and the miraculous medals and fixed around his neck. Like, even though we have accounts from guys talking about what Antietam was like for units like the Irish Brigade, there's just something about that, isn't there? It's much more impactful almost than their accounts, is that type of object that you can see and you can hold and you can touch.
Mm-hmm.
So, Damian, just to kind of wrap up on the whole archaeological piece of your career, I'm kind of curious about, and maybe I'm incorrect about this, a transition more from archaeology towards more history work. Why that happened? Was it something to do with the nature of archaeology being demanding, in the sense that, you kind of alluded to the fact when you went to Vinegar Hill, you have a very limited block of time. People are kind of hurrying you along, and that can be kind of difficult, I would think. And it's a tension that I understand exists in the archaeological field.
Yeah, well, I suppose it's more of a complete melding now rather than a distinct move. So I was working in commercial archaeology for a large portion of my career. So development-led archaeology, if you like. So doing work in advance of major roads and major housing developments, etc. But when I did my first stint in that, I went and I worked as a curator in the National Museum of Ireland for a few years, where I was working specifically with a team. There was a team of us there who were working to develop the Soldiers and Chiefs Military History Exhibition. So I spent a few years in the museum doing that, just working on military collections, and then went back into commercial archaeology for a long, long time. I was there until 2017 again. So for another 14, 15 years. But all throughout that time, I almost kept the conflict archaeology was a specialism that was often, sometimes it came into the commercial archaeology I was doing, and sometimes it was done outside that. And it's something I continue to do. I'm actually working on Civil War, Irish Civil War archaeological sites now. I do quite a bit on Revolutionary period archaeology at the moment. And that's all just, well, to be quite blunt, it's all free stuff I do in my spare time, most of it. So occasionally it gets funded. But yeah, I became more and more consumed, I suppose, by the American Civil War as I was working all the time in archaeology, which was also being done in my spare time. And that was really what prompted my move back into going into history full time. And I imagine going forward it's going to be more of a mix between the two. But it was the American Civil War that prompted me to just fully dedicate myself for the last 3 years back into that wholesale.
So, it's interesting because obviously you're in Ireland, you grew up in Ireland. Why the focus on the American Civil War? What's the leap? Did you watch Gone with the Wind or something? Or what triggered it?
I'd be working on the Confederates if I was a big fan. But no, it came from, I was mentioning that time I went into the National Museum of Ireland. And so when we had that job there, the National Museum had been given a big former military barracks called Collins Barracks to develop into one of their branches. And one of the agreements when it was handed over by the Irish Army was that there'd be a military exhibition put in there. And so the main curator was Lara Joy, and there was a couple of colleagues, myself, Siobhan Pearce and Brendan Malone, were all working on this together. And it was the biggest exhibition the National Museum had ever put on. It's still there. You can still visit it if you ever get a chance in Collins Barracks in Dublin. And it was to do the entire military history of the Irish people from 1550 all the way through to the present day, all the way through to the current UN. And so we all had our different areas that we were particularly keen on, a number of different. So obviously I was big into the 16th and 17th century stuff. I've always had quite a big interest in things like the Irish and the British Army and the Napoleonic Wars, that sort of thing. But one of the galleries is dedicated to the Americans. And I had always had an interest in the American Civil War going back years and the Irish in it and everything. But when we were developing that gallery in particular, I was reading an awful lot around it. And again, this is the early 2000s. And it just became more and more incredible to me, the apparent scale of Irish involvement, but the utter lack of any knowledge or major research or memory of it in Ireland. I couldn't get over it. And we're here now years and years later. I still can't get over it, to be honest. But that was where that started. And I, started off by buying, I'm a bibliophile. I buy way too many books. And I started buying more books on the Civil War, and then just went down the rabbit hole that I've never re-emerged from. And then a little over 10 years ago, blogging was kind of, was particularly beginning to get fairly big around then. And I think I was kind of bored one Sunday afternoon, and I said, look, I'll start something to try and raise a bit of awareness about the Civil War in Ireland. Obviously, it's always been a big deal for Irish Americans, but within Ireland, it hasn't been. And so I started that website 10 years ago, and I've been publishing 3 articles. Had 3 articles every month for the last 10 years and trying to put resources on it. And it just became utterly consuming to everything I do. And I suppose that's kind of what led to that dive into the endless world of the American Civil War.
Damian, I may be skipping ahead a little bit, but you talked about how it's not appreciated or understood or studied in Ireland very much right now, the American Civil War, the Irish connection. But I was reading something, an interview you were in, and it sounds like at the time it was making headlines. It was you relate that letters were going back and forth across the Atlantic and making their ways into the Irish newspapers pretty quickly, not like real time, but, not bad that there were reports on American battles, Fort Sumter, with the Irish component there. So it sounds like it maybe was a little more of a headline at the time.
It most certainly was. Yeah, it most certainly was. And so anybody living anywhere in any community across Ireland would have known at the time who were in the American Civil War, who were involved in it, and would have been aware of it in real time. From the most rural areas, I have people down, down in Valencia Island, down in West Kerry, talking about their people in the American Civil War and having dreams about them and this sort of stuff. It was all over the place. It was the major item in the newspapers. So when the firing starts on Fort Sumter, the Cork Examiner, which was the big paper in Cork, it's still the big paper in Cork, were writing about what it was going to mean for Irish firesides. They weren't talking about a short war that'll be over by Christmas. They were fairly prescient in their predictions, and they said that there was going to be many Irish firesides that were going to suffer huge loss because of this conflict that had erupted in the United States. And it stayed that way, and it was very connected to what was going on then. But I think there's an interesting dynamic about immigrants and people who left, even with the people who were left behind, that there was almost a loss of memory there, some of it intentional. And again, that's something that we could go into, but there's a few myths that have built up. My reading of, for example, individuals in the 1850s and 1860s who emigrate is that they are always seen as the lucky side of the relationship between people who go and stay. We tend to look at them all as victims now, and indeed they had very hard lives. In contemporary society, the person who stayed was seen as more of a victim, based on the families that I come across. So there was a responsibility on the person who went to America to try and get those people to the United States, or at least to financially support them. And I think there was elements, there's elements built in then of jealousy of people who get to go and who don't come back. And as the generations pass, then even though chain migration and everything stays really prominent for about 40 or 50 years, and all the way through the 20th century, obviously, but for particularly up until the early years of the 20th century, that there's a kind of a loss of memory because those lives are now in the United States. And they were almost the lucky ones to get away. So there's a lot of really interesting dynamics as to why it isn't remembered in the same way. I do think that the big one in Ireland, and it's true everywhere, is that really the huge engagement that people have with history today, particularly in the digital age of the World Wide Web, is through personal genealogical interest. It fed a kind of a groundswell of stuff here about the First World War. I think a lot of people who felt the First World War had been forgotten in Ireland, and Irish participation in the First World War felt that way because it had been forgotten within their own families. And so when people start to look at stuff, they start to look at their grandparents, their great-grandparents. And the Irish immigrants have one of the lowest rates of return of any immigrants. Once they leave, they stayed away in the 19th century, usually. And so the descendants of people who fought in the American Civil War are all Americans now. The descendants of people who fought in the First World War who were Irish are still in Ireland, if you get me. So people, when they're looking at their own family history and looking at history through that lens, they just don't see the contribution that they made because that link was broken. We don't look at diaspora history in Ireland at all. We have very few professional academic historians who are fully focused on diaspora in Ireland, for example. We're very insular in our history.
You mentioned the word genealogy, and that's a topic near and dear to Martin Nutty. And I think he'd probably like to get into the topic of the pension funds and the pension files and the research you did there. Martin, you might have a better question on that topic, but that seems like a good place to go next.
Well, I would guess, Damian, because what I've gleaned from your blog is you've clearly made this to be a central part of your research. It'd be interesting for you to talk about, when did you realize that would kind of give you kind of a more unique insight? And B, what triggered that?
Yeah. You'd be dead right, Martin. Getting that. I don't think I'm ever going to escape these pension files for as long as I live. It just absolutely, whatever about the Civil War itself, these pension files just completely consume me. So it's actually an interesting road towards why I saw them as so important. It may surprise you to know this, but because it's quite isolating if you're working on the American Civil War in Ireland. We don't have an American Civil War roundtable. We don't have discussion. So I go off and give lectures all the time. But for example, I have still, after a decade working in the field, never been at a conference that's dedicated to the American Civil War. Never spoken at one. We just don't. There's never been one in Ireland. I've never even spoken at a panel at an academic conference that was fully dedicated to the American Civil War. So we just do not have it. So it's very isolating if you're working on this material in Ireland. And I was looking for a way. I have a love of doing research. I have a love, if it's archaeology, of going out into the field and finding new material and learning stuff. I didn't want to just be looking at books that other people have read and parsing that on the blog. And so I started to look at ways I could get at material. And some ways you can do that through newspapers. You're well familiar with all this from your own research for your own blog or for your own podcast, the types of methods that you start to look at. And
Thank you for the plug on that, Damian.
No matter, it's really good.
The Nutty Chronicles, available wherever fine podcasts are sold.
Definitely tune in. But so when I was looking at stuff, I came across this website. It was then called footnote.com, and it seemed to offer access to American military records. It's since changed to fold3.com. And there I started looking at these files that were pension files for widows and dependents of mainly American Civil War veterans. And they range in pages from about 10 to 100 pages of documents that were submitted by people who had lost either a son or a husband or a brother in American military service during the American Civil War immediately afterwards, and who were applying to the federal government for a monthly pension as a result. And it fairly quickly, you can almost actually, if you go back to the start when I start writing about them on the blog, you can see the progression of almost me realizing their potential. And a potential that I think is unmatched. I think it's quite clear because people had to give huge amounts of social information. So you have affidavits of otherwise illiterate Irish immigrants, ordinary working class people living in the 5 Points or wherever it may be, looking to get this money, and they're giving you their life story. They're telling you about their immigration, their marriage, what their jobs are. Other people are talking about it, where they live, all of this sort of material. And I quickly became convinced, and I remain convinced, that it is the greatest source of information about ordinary Irish people in the 19th century that exists anywhere in the world. That includes Ireland. And if you want a good marker of how enough diaspora history is not done in Ireland, they hadn't been recognised as such by any historian of Ireland prior to that. I think there should be a Irish government-funded initiative to try and get as much information out of these as humanly possible, to be quite honest, because they're so rich. And I started doing that, and then I started to, I like doing things like Excel spreadsheets and kind of things like that for some strange reason. So I began to look at them in a more refined way, and it became clear to me that some of these people were including original correspondence that were written by or written for Irish American soldiers who served in the Union military. And that was particularly significant because if you look at the writings about the Irish in the Civil War, one of the things that just jumps out at you, it's said in almost the front couple of pages of every book written about the Irish and the American Civil War, is that there are no letters really from ordinary men. They just don't survive because so many of them are illiterate. Working class people tended to move around a lot. They were renting tenements in different parts. And if you move around a lot like that, possessions don't get handed down the way they do for middle and upper class people. So collections of letters get lost through generations. And so they didn't exist. And it became apparent that if I went through this, I could get these letters. And so I spent this was, again, spare time when I was working in the archaeological field. I would spend my evenings. There's about 160 odd thousand of these files are digitized. It's about it's 11 or 13% of the total number. There's 1.6 million of these files sitting in the National Archives in Pennsylvania Avenue in DC. And this percentage, this 160,000 plus percentage, have been digitized, and I started to systematically go through them all by state, by unit, looking to see could I identify Irish American correspondence. I built a database of it, and that was what prompted me when I finished that, and I'd written quite a bit about it, and on the blog, and then I said, listen, I better go back. One of the hazards if you put stuff up on a blog is that it is an unfortunate hazard of it. You tend to particularly if you put research up, you're running the risk that the research is just used and you don't necessarily get credited for it. So between that and the fact that there was clearly, I felt there was so much new to say based on these letters, that was what prompted me then to quit archaeology full time, if you like, and go back to pursue exploring what these letters could tell us about American service, Irish American service.
So you mentioned an astonishing number there, 160,000 files. And just for listeners, can you wrap some numbers around the scale of Irish-born involvement in the American Civil War, just to kind of get a sense of these? And I know you use the hashtag Forgotten Irish quite a lot on Twitter, but if you could kind of just lay that out, what are we talking about here? Are we talking about Irish Americans, in other words, the sons of Irish people, or are we talking about Irish-born? Because I think it's a mix, right?
It's a mix, and I classify it, and I think it's very important to maintain the mix. So I would contend, and I do contend and argue that there's been a long underestimation of Irish American service in the Union military. We should clarify, I suppose, that the files are only Union files because for obvious reasons, the Confederates were not entitled to federal pensions after the American Civil War because they had fought against the United States. So they became eligible, I believe, in the 1950s.
A little late.
Yeah, a bit late. There wasn't too many to be picking it up then. So it's been underestimated. I won't go into it here, but there's a reason it has. But the number of Irish born in the service, as I estimated, is in and around 180,000. Who serve the Union. So that's just, if you want to look at it in kind of global terms, Professor David Gleeson in Northumbria, who I'm working with on the PhD, he's my supervisor on it. He's the expert on the Irish in the South, and he's found 20,000 Irish fought for the Confederacy, which are high numbers for the Irish in the South, but it's all about where the populations were. But so 9 times as many Irish born are fighting for the Union than there for the South. So, when we talk about the Civil War, it's overwhelmingly a story of the Irish fight for the United States. So there's 180,000 Irish born, but if you look at some fabulous scholarship on Irish America that's being done, and again, it's something that these files show, the Irish, so nativity is not a marker of Irishness in America in the 1860s, because it's not the way they operated. Because, and I mean, I know you and your listeners will be all too familiar with this, but there was an awful lot of anti-Irish Catholic prejudice in the States in the 1840s and the 1850s, things like the Know Nothing Party. So there was an extraordinary ethnic cohesiveness among the Irish there. The Irish also tended to be step migrants. So the Irish, for example, who couldn't afford to go to America, might be able to afford to go to Britain. And they might live in Liverpool or Manchester or the northeast of England or London or the central belt of Scotland for 10 or 15 or 20 years. And they then might go to America, or their children might go to America, or they might go to Canada first. They might have come through Grosse Ile in the middle of the famine and spent time there. So you have an awful lot of people who were born in Canada, born in Britain, and of course, born in America. Like there was a lot of wards in New York, for example, had distinctive Irish character by the 1830s, long before the famine. So there are people born into those communities who see themselves as ethnically Irish. And I argue American as well, but as ethnically Irish. And so they're all part of that story. So the best figures we have for that, to me, suggest that about 70,000 or so of the guys who enlist in the Union, who were born to Irish parents, but were in America, would have regarded as ethnically Irish. So I placed a figure, and I think it's a conservative figure, at around 250,000 men in the Union military are ethnic Irish. Just to give you a kind of a handle on, it's fairly different, because if you read most works, including my first book, if you read my first book, that's 100,000 more men than are normally assigned to being ethnically Irish in the Union military. So I think it's a kind of a sea change in how we have to perceive all of these guys. But so that's around about 180,000 born, about 70,000 plus ethnically Irish who are fighting for the Union.
I'm curious, we're kind of talking about, ethnically Irish or Irish. And I'm just curious, and this is not necessarily apropos of the Civil War discussion, as to what the hell does it mean to be Irish? Do you have to be born within the geographic confines of the island to be Irish? Or how do you see that as an Irishman?
I've always detested the nativity thing anyway. I suppose, I have personal reasons for that. I was born in England. And moved back when I was 10 months old. So, if you were to go off, if somebody in 150 years came along and said, okay, well, was this guy Irish or was he not? And they were just looking at, say, a census return that said I was born in Essex, in England, then you're not assigned to where I think it's pretty apparent that I would regard myself as Irish. So that it's a real problem. Nativity just simply cannot be used to any reasonable degree for it. Now, there is a problem when you're dealing with 19th century sources, for example, because it's very hard to see into people's souls to see, well, how do they feel? How do we think they might identify? But you can only look at the broad range of evidence that demonstrates, for example, that Irish ethnicity has nothing to do with that. And it's one of the things that annoys me quite substantially, I have to say, about the relationship that you sometimes see now between Ireland and its diaspora. Because I think there is a real tendency in Ireland to see being Irish as linked only to your nativity. I think things are changing a bit within the island itself in terms of its multiculturalism. We've had an awfully progressive time over the last 20, 25 years when we've had an influx of people and we have this kind of great cultural mix that's beginning to emerge in Ireland, which is really healthy and vibrant, I think. And it's created its own challenges for, I think, a minority of the population. But that's being accepted. I think that's being accepted a bit more than, for example, the entitlement of someone in the United States to have an Irish identity. And I've particularly in the years worked on it, I really feel that's a problem. That we see that the only form of Irishness is being born and raised in Ireland. That somebody who was connected, whose people left Ireland, be it during the famine or during the 1950s, who ends up in the Bronx or wherever it is, isn't entitled to any sort of feeling of Irish identity because of that. I have a big problem. It mightn't be the same Irish identity. So I see the Irish identity that exists in the United States is patently not the same as the Irish identity that exists in Ireland. But just because of that, it doesn't mean that it's not equally valid. So that is something I think Ireland kind of needs to cop itself on a bit about, to be honest, about accepting the sense of Irish identity that exists among our diaspora, because it's so huge.
Damian, that's a great place. This is really our agenda with Irish Stew. My background is, I say all my grandparents came from Ireland, but truthfully, like you say, step migration. I know one of them was born in England en route to Ireland. So, we're really exploring that. I've been active in a group called the Irish American Writers and Artists that I think you should check out, because it's really a group dedicated to kind of exploring an Irish American identity that's related to, but distinct from an Irish identity. So a lot of great discussion and exploration along those lines.
Just as kind of like a couple of finish up questions, I'd like to ask you about how you, as an Irishman, because I know you come and do kind of Civil War battlefield stuff over this side of the Atlantic, how that plays out with your audience of Americans or Irish Americans. How are you received?
Oh, I couldn't speak highly enough of how I'm received. It's another thing. I mean, it's often, and I hear a lot of people from the States talk about, the welcome they get in Ireland and everything. I mean, I just, it's incomparable, in my opinion, to the genuine warmth and generosity that I've experienced every time I've been to the States. Like, it might surprise you, but I actually had never managed to get to the United States before 6 years ago. I had never been there. So it's, I've had lots of opportunities since that time to do so. But it's amazing, actually, to be able to do it. It's funny, like I've had a number of people say to me, like over there, we had a great opportunity to do a tour of the 69th New York State Militia's actions on the Bull Run battlefield. Harry Smeltzer, who runs the brilliant Bull Runnings website, organised it, and we did that. And like there were people talking about how great it was to hear somebody with an Irish accent talking about these people on the battlefields. I think people sometimes feel it gives almost a sense of the guys, the way they would have sounded or spoken to. I was just recently doing something, for a museum over in Wisconsin who were doing an immigration thing. So they asked me, this is quite a funny story, actually. They asked me to record a few commands, for them, because they had audio visual going into their museum. And, so it was like the manual of arms and things like ready, aim, fire and all this sort of stuff. And so I was recording it there about a month ago. I waited for my other half to leave the house because I didn't want to be shouting out orders like that in the house when there was anybody else in it.
It might cause some domestic conflict.
Exactly. So I was there anyway, all set up, and I started the recording, and I started the ready, aim, fire, and then I got a knock on the door just as I said it. And I'd forgotten it. Actually completely passed me by, I think, because I've been in England for so long, but there's no postal service on a Saturday morning, or at least there was this weekend. And there was the postman who must have thought, I'd say, he was about to call the police, as he was about to be under fire and shot through the door in rural County Cork. But yeah, that's an interesting aspect of it. But I have to be honest, like I've never had anything but the most incredible experience every time I've gone there, because, it's obviously very special for me because it's so, I do not have the access that a lot of people would have if you live in those areas. I don't have access to that type of, so the history I work on virtually all the time, that's, I suppose, become my biggest passion, is on the other side of the Atlantic. So when I get an opportunity to even visit New York or visit one of these battlefields, it's amazing. But it's like, it's just been made all the better. Like I've never gone anywhere where there hasn't been friends who I've made online or whatever, that you encounter them are willing to offer to put you up or to walk around with you. And then the engagement that you get when you're discussing these sort of things in a historical framework is just fantastic. You can't beat it. And it is one of the tough things of the lockdown. Obviously there are much more serious things in life, but it has been, unfortunately, not being able to get to the States this year has been a big, one of the big personal setbacks. The sooner we can all start doing that again, the better.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are suffering from lack of travel.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Just to kind of wrap this up, you mentioned, or I think I mentioned a little bit, the fact that you're coming to finishing up your PhD in Northumbria.
Yeah.
What's the plans going forward for the site, for this research? Where do you see yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know is the honest answer. The site's a lot of work. It's a big passion. It's a lot of work. So the long-term future of the site, I'd like to think I'm going to maintain it as it goes forward, but it is a massive undertaking. But I will certainly be remaining. I have to make a decision on that over the next couple of years, I think. I'd like to see it maybe become more collaborative with other people. That takes a bit, because there's a massive amount of work in consistently having to produce the material for it. And I've been very lucky with the Patreon and with people supporting the site, because it would never have kept going other than that. Yourself among them, Martin, which I'm very appreciative of. But so I'll always be maintaining work on the Civil War. I mean, the next thing I would be keen, once I've concluded the PhD, to try and get that published as a book, in terms of the letters. And I wanted, look at a number of publications out about that, because I've gathered together now in the region of 1,200 letters written by American Civil War Irish Americans. And I want to get them out to as wide an audience as possible and look at different areas of trying to progress that. So I will be staying very engaged with the Irish and the American Civil War, but I also will be staying, I would imagine, at least in the short term, engaged with Irish heritage. I'm already working on a couple of projects in relation to that over here at the moment, and I'll probably now, when I'm finished up in the PhD, be doing a bit more of that, particularly over the next little while. So I do a lot of like public archaeology, public history kind of work in terms of trying to get all of that information out into a public sphere. So that's probably what's going to keep me occupied, I'd imagine, for the next few months at least.
Great. So I just want to thank you for coming on. Well, thank you on behalf of John. He's run into some kind of technical difficulties. It was really enlightening. And it's the kind of conversations that both John and I, want to have with Irish people, whether they have a dash in their Irishness or not, meaning, whether they're Anglo-Irish or Irish American, etc. I think these are very kind of constructive conversations. And Ireland, I think on many levels, is becoming increasingly a globally engaged country. And anything, that we can do to kind of facilitate that going forward, we're really interested in having that conversation, because I think it's a huge untapped resource. So we'd love to have you on again. There's obviously so much more to talk about, and we really kind of look forward to kind of tracking your career going forward. And if you could just tell the listeners, where's the best place to kind of track you down and find your work and engage with what you're doing, that would be kind of a nice way to finish up. Yeah, absolutely, Martin. And thanks to yourself and John for the invite. Very enjoyable chat. But anybody wants to have a look at some of the Civil War work, if you just go to www.irishamericancivilwar.com, you can find it. Any of your Twitter people or anything like that, I'm on there as Irish ACW as well. So, I mean, that's kind of the base place for getting me. There's a few websites I have going around the place, but the American Civil War one is the place to start. All the best stuff on it anyway. And I'll plug for you again. Damian, you can also find him on Patreon. What handle do you use for Patreon there? It's Irish ACW as well. Yeah, / Irish ACW. Right. And so thanks so much. We will continue to be in touch, and we'll talk again soon. Cheers, Martin.
Really fascinating discussion there from Damian. I learned a bunch. I never heard the term commercial archaeologist before, and certainly never heard about a battlefield archaeologist. And the picture that he painted there with uncovering the rows of lead shot, evidence of nervous soldiers not able to reload as the opposing troops were coming at them. That was really vivid to me. That's like one image that sort of told the story. Yeah, I think what Damian is really getting at is a visceral sense of the experience as lived by the troops in the field. We're not talking about generals here. We're talking about the guys that are right on the front line. And this is one of the great things that battlefield archaeology reveals. I was also very taken by Damian's discussion of the scale of the native-born Irish in the American Civil War. It's astonishing numbers. He talks about 180,000 native-born Irish fighting on the Union side, some 20,000 fighting on the Confederate side, another 50 to 70,000 who would be, I guess, in today's parlance, considered to be Irish Americans. In other words, they are born in America but of Irish extraction. Collectively, those numbers are bigger than any participation of Irish people in any military engagement throughout history. It's just astonishing. He added some other context there too about, I think you referred to the nativity, the idea of Irish people move to Liverpool, stay within an Irish community in Liverpool, pull up a few years later and move to Canada, migrate to Canada. At what point are these people still Irish? Have they become Irish, British, Canadian briefly, and then they migrate down to the U.S. I thought that was really interesting. It plays into what we're trying to work with here in our global Irish nation. And then, of course, Damian is such a perfect citizen of the global Irish nation. You know, born in London, grows up in Ireland. His career is largely based in Ireland, but he's getting his doctorate in the UK, and his focus is so often over here in the United States on the American Civil War.
A really great conversation. Hopefully we manage to get him on again at some point in time.
Be great. Thanks for joining us for another Global Irish Nation conversation. To see what we're stirring up next, follow us on Twitter at Irish Stewcast or like us on Facebook at Irish Stew Podcast. And you're very welcome to join Martin Nutty and me, John Lee, anytime for another serving of Irish Stew.
Irish Stew is produced by John Lee, Martin Nutty, and Bill Schultz. Editing, mixing, and mastering by Bill Schultz. Music on Irish Stew was composed and performed by Rosa Nutty, with Donald Bowens on drums, Cathal O'Riordan on bass and synthesizer. For more on Rosa Nutty's music, please visit rosanutty.com.